On this edition of The Correspondents, a war of words between the White House and Israel's Prime Minister as a new ceasefire is declared in Syria. President Obama's legacy. With less than 3 weeks left in his second term, we'll take a closer look at a few of his most defining moments. And final goodbyes, remembering some of the celebrities we lost in the final days of 2016. Hello and welcome to The Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Arcega in Washington. Well, 2016 is ending on quite a tumultuous note. In his final weeks in office, President Obama threw down the gauntlet to both Russia's Vladimir Putin and Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, creating a lot of uncertainty around the world as we start a new year. We'll have more on that in just a moment, but first, a potential ceasefire in a civil war that's displaced millions of people already. Syria announcing a truce taking effect Friday between its army and some 62,000 opposition fighters. Russia and Turkey negotiated the deal and will take charge of compliance. Now, it sets the stage for possible peace talks in February between the Syrian government and opposition groups, but it's important to note that this ceasefire does not include militant groups like Islamic State or Jabhat al-Nusra. And to discuss those issues and more, we are joined by our Moscow-based correspondent Daniel Schearf, who joins us via Skype from the Russian capital. And right here in our D.C. studio, Scott Bobb, veteran journalist and VOA's former Jerusalem bureau chief. I thank both of you gentlemen for joining us today. There's much to discuss, so Daniel, I'm going to start with you. On this latest attempt, at least at a ceasefire in Syria. It's only a few hours old, but some reports are suggesting it's already starting to fray. What can you tell us about that? Is this ceasefire holding?
Well, unfortunately, almost immediately we started getting reports of some clashes taking place that appears to have intensified somewhat in the last 24 hours with both air raids and fighting taking place between rebel groups and the Syrian government forces, even outside of Damascus. So to call it a countrywide ceasefire would be inaccurate, but there's still hopes that they may be able to come to some sort of a peaceful resolution. There's still diplomatic efforts taking place, and Russian officials have been saying they're still working on making these talks happen in Kazakhstan. So we'll see exactly how productive they can be in heading in that direction. Of course, if they can't establish a lasting ceasefire, then we're probably going to see some of the groups who agreed to it pulling out of it. So, once again, a very tenuous ceasefire.
Daniel, is this ceasefire any different from the previous ones we've seen that have failed, essentially?
Well, it's different in that it was brokered by Russia and Turkey. The previous couple ceasefires that we had involved the United States. Unfortunately, those ceasefires didn't last very long. Whether or not this one's going to last any longer, of course, is up in the air. We also have guarantees from Russia and Turkey that they're going to push each side that they represent in this conflict. On the Turkish side, support for some rebel groups, and on the Russian side, support for President Bashar al-Assad. So whether or not they can bring these guys to the table, of course, is going to become more difficult if we see clashes continuing or perhaps even intensifying.
Mm-hmm. Now, Scott Bobb, let me get you in this conversation. You've spent some time in that part of the world. Are you optimistic at all that this ceasefire is finally going to take hold?
I think it's going to take a long time to get something that really is durable. The conflict is so factionalized. There's so many different groups, each with their own leaders and their own agendas, that it's just going to take a lot of negotiations, persistent, and there will be failures, there will fallbacks and so forth. But after a length of time, when everyone gets tired of fighting, then you might have a solution like in Lebanon.
So for the people of Syria, we're just keeping our fingers crossed. But Scott, the other big development this week, of course, was the big spat between the White House and Israel. What do you make of what's going on there right now?
Well, I would call this parting shots. Okay. There's never been a love lost between Mr. Netanyahu and Obama, and the Obama administration decided to sort of make a final statement by not vetoing the resolution on the settlements. And of course, Mr. Netanyahu had to respond, and he vigorously, which the Israeli leaders always do when they feel their interests are threatened.
Right, and we heard just this Thursday State Secretary John Kerry speaking for over an hour, trying to defend the U.S. Action, not vetoing this UN Security Council resolution. And I believe we have a clip of what both Secretary Kerry and Israel's Prime Minister had to say. I don't believe I have that clip right now, but okay, so we do have that clip. So this all started by way of background just after the U.S. failed to veto the UN resolution, criticizing, of course, Israel's settlement into Palestinian-occupied territory. And then just as things were starting to cool off, of course, Mr. Kerry delivered the 70-minute speech, which, of course, was followed almost immediately by a rebuttal from Bibi Netanyahu. Let's have a listen to what he had to say, and I'll ask you for comments afterwards. Okay.
They have a choice. They can choose to live together in one state, or they can separate into two states. But here is a fundamental reality. If the choice is one state, Israel can either be Jewish or democratic. It cannot be both.
What he did was to spend most of his speech blaming Israel for the lack of peace by passionately condemning a policy of enabling Jews to live in their historic homeland and in their eternal capital, Jerusalem.
So Scott, how badly has this little back and forth damaged relations between the United States and Israel?
I don't think it's going to do much permanent damage or long-term damage. This has happened before. Israel, historically, Israeli leaders, especially the strong ones, have been willing to stand up to the United States. Like you think of David Ben-Gurion.
This is not the first time they've
at all.
Done this.
They stood up to Eisenhower and Kennedy over their nuclear weapons programs. Netanyahu has many times criticized the Obama administration on Iran and on other things. In the end, they come back, they realize that the security interests are still very strong and in fact strengthened under Mr. Obama. So I think this was just a farewell statement of position and waiting for the next administration to come in and see if things change.
Some pundits were calling this the end for a two-state solution. Do you agree with them? Is this it for the peace talks?
I think it becomes harder with time, especially as more and more settlers build settlements in the occupied West Bank. But no, I don't think it's the end, because every time negotiations have broken off, even for years, when they start up again, they come back to where they left off, more or less. So I don't think it's the end of the two-state, at least as an ideal. It may never happen. It may never be practical. It's getting more and more difficult. Now you just have mosaics of communities behind barbed wire and walls and so forth. So it's increasingly difficult, but it's still not impossible in my view.
Okay, and that's good to hear. Daniel, since you are there's so many issues to talk about. One of them I'd like to get your take on, another big issue that's been making the rounds this week. A set of new sweeping sanctions against Russia announced by the Obama administration on Thursday, punishing Russia for allegedly interfering with the 2016 election. Has there been any response, official reaction from Moscow? What can you tell us?
Yeah, well, we were expecting tit-for-tat sanctions response, at least on the diplomatic side, as part of these sanctions from the Obama administration. There was also the expulsion of 35 Russian diplomats from the United States, and that was expected to be reciprocated here in Moscow, but that did not happen. In fact, President Putin announced that he would not be, well, as he put it, stooping to that level, and that he would not expel any diplomats at this time. But he did say that he would reserve the right to take action if there are not some good measures put in place by the Trump administration once the inauguration takes place to try and improve relations. So a bit of a surprise move, especially considering that his own foreign minister was advising President Putin to to take this reciprocal action against American diplomats today. So a very shrewd move on his part, actually, to try and basically, as Scott Bobb just put it, have a parting shot against the Obama administration and to lay out a bit of a red carpet for the Trump administration to move forward with bilateral relations.
Okay, I got like 10 seconds left. Big picture look at this since the new administration is going to come in. Does any of this matter, Scott?
It matters, of course, but I think it will be a new page. But Mr. Trump will confront the same challenges as Mr. Obama did during his 8 years.
I thank you both, Daniel and Scott. We're going to take a quick short break right now, but when we come back, a look back at some of the defining moments that may shape President Obama's legacy. This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.